Today we're going to learn about the principles of landscape painting. We'll discuss the different elements that go into creating a successful landscape painting, as well as some tips and tricks for getting started. Whether you're a beginner or an experienced artist, this course will help you improve your landscape painting skills. While I am speaking mostly to digital artists, most of these principles are universal and can be applied to traditional painting as well. Before you start painting, it's important to do some preparation. This includes choosing reference images, selecting a subject, and thinking about the composition of your painting. We'll start with reference images first. I tried to sort these principles into a logical order, but these steps are fairly fluid and can be done in a different order. For example, some artists might explore references first to get inspiration, while others may have a subject in mind already. In this case, I'll be looking through some images before I choose my subject. Traditionally, artists have relied primarily on either photos of reference or direct observation. While some artists are able to capture their own photos for reference, that can still be quite limiting. We can't all afford to travel to some exotic place to capture an image of sand dunes or a waterfall. This is why many artists choose to download images off the internet. While this is fairly commonplace, it is also not exactly legal. As artists, we want our work to be respected and not used without our permission. The same goes for those photographers who artists are stealing reference images from. There are, of course, photographers who make their work free to use by designating it as public domain or Creative Commons, but oftentimes images that are protected by copyright are used to create artwork. There are some workarounds to this dilemma. First, you can use a copyright-protected image as inspiration or loosely as a reference. For example, you don't copy the image exactly and choose a different composition. Trees and mountains are not copyright protected, so if you're just getting an idea of what something looks like, that's perfectly acceptable. Second, you can pay for images if you need to copy them more precisely. For example, you can purchase stock images to use. And third, you can ask permission. You might be surprised that some photographers are willing to let you use their work for free as long as you give them credit. But working from images sourced online is still quite limiting. Even if I were to choose to just steal a copyrighted image, I might not ever find one I am satisfied with. That's why I am a fan of using AI-generated images. There are some pros and cons to this approach, which I will explain, but this method gives you the most freedom to get the exact type of reference you want. Not only can you choose the subjects, composition, color, style, lighting, and many other properties, but the results are random. This means you can generate unique images that no one else has ever used. I use Adobe Firefly, which is very good and updated regularly. The images Firefly was trained on are from photographers who opted to let their work be used for this purpose. Even so, every image is sort of chewed up and regurgitated so that it's nearly impossible to pick out the work of any one person. Therefore, this is a goldmine for artists because you essentially have limitless references to choose from, tailored to your own personal desire. In my opinion, this is one of the best things that has happened to traditional and digital artists, and it outweighs the negative aspects of AI, such as people passing off AI-generated art as human-made. The main reason not to use AI-generated images is that AI makes mistakes. It may not always be that way, but for now you can't fully trust that AI is going to make an accurate image for you. It's very important to be knowledgeable enough about the subject you are painting so that you can recognize mistakes in your AI-generated references. Some mistakes are obvious, but many are so subtle that you might not ever notice until someone looks at your painting and informs you. This is why I would recommend using photographs from real life to verify the details in your generated reference are correct. I will also mention that you can combine multiple images together or modify them if you need to. For example, I can bring a generated reference into Photoshop and use generative fill to change features and add subjects. If I need to change colors or make corrections, I can do that as well. I only briefly mentioned it earlier, but direct observation is another great reference. I know from experience that it's difficult to paint digitally outdoors, but it can be done. And it really gives you the opportunity to see more than what can be captured in a photo. While we're on the topic of observation, that is another skill you should practice when painting landscapes or anything for that matter. Observation allows you to store reference images in your brain. With enough observations, you can paint landscapes without needing to look at any reference at all. Many of the principles we will explore in this lesson can be memorized and drawn upon at any time. When I paint, I don't use a list like this, it's all in my head. I can just paint landscapes because I know all of the rules, and you will too if you practice. So rather than just trying to copy a reference, take time to think about it and make observations. Observing is not simply looking at something, it's making mental connections about specific details. Your goal should be to understand and memorize the basic rules of nature. Once you have some inspiration or references, you can move on to the next step. Every great landscape painting needs a primary subject. If your painting is a story, then this is the main character. I'm not talking about a person, a tree or a cloud can be your primary subject. In this painting, I have this lone oak tree as the main character. One could argue that the mountain in the background is the main subject, but since this is my painting, I say it's the tree. You certainly can have more than one character in your story, but it helps if there is one main focal point to draw viewers' attention to. What you want to avoid is not having any subject. For example, if I were to paint a bunch of non-distinct trees or a sky full of clouds, nothing really stands out. This is more of a background than a painting. A background is just begging to be completed by adding a subject to it. Here you can see some of my other landscape paintings that have a clearly defined subject. In this painting, the subject is human. Without this character and her flowing green dress, all I have painted is a boring field. Sure, it's detailed and colorful, but it doesn't capture attention for very long. It's just not remarkable. Your subject could be non-human animals as well. Without the subject, I have another boring background. Here's an example where architecture is the primary subject. There is a cabin that your eye is drawn to. Once you have a subject or subjects, you need to give them a purpose. What is the story of your painting? The story can be simple, or it can be very complex, but you need some sort of context for people to engage with your work. A colorful or detailed painting is pleasant to look at for a moment, but quickly the brain moves on if there is nothing else to it. If you can capture even a few more seconds or minutes of someone's attention, that's valuable. It might make the difference in someone buying your art, hiring you, or just leaving a like or comment. In the case of my oak tree painting, I have left the story somewhat open to interpretation, but there are some clues as to what's going on. For example, there is this fence surrounding the tree. That gives the viewer the impression that maybe this is a farm or a place where someone lives. In the distance, there is a path that cuts through the trees and goes down to a distant lake. If I take the fence and path away, then there is just a tree. That's less of a story and makes the painting less interesting. If I compare the two, which one can you guess more about? What are these places? What is their purpose? I'm willing to bet you have lots of ideas about the one with the fence. What is the fence keeping in or out? Is this private property or a park? Why has no one repaired the fence? You can't say much about the tree and the mountain on their own. If I go back to this painting, we can get an impression of its story. Who is the woman in the green dress and why is she here? In this painting, there is a path that leads to this house. Who lives there? The mile marker sign implies that this is a hiking trail. Rules are meant to be broken, so while a story can make your painting more engaging, you can also opt to leave it out. Here's a painting of some rolling mountains. There isn't any sort of story here that is obvious, but sometimes that's how nature is. If the painting is dramatic enough to make the observer feel like they are inside of it, then that still leaves some room for them to create their own story. Maybe someone can look at this and imagine they are fishing in the lake or hiking on trails. Still, I think that if I were to add some sort of context, this painting would capture attention for longer. I'll use AI to generate a hot air balloon in the sky, and already you can see how it makes it more interesting. The composition of your painting is the configuration of the elements on the canvas. A good composition will help to create a visually appealing and interesting painting. The primary goal of composition is to establish an aesthetically pleasing arrangement of all of the objects in the scene. You can do this while creating your reference image, or you can sketch onto the canvas or make small, simple paintings known as studies. You may need to make several attempts at your composition before you are satisfied with it. Some objects will have to be in a certain place. For example, clouds are usually at the top of the composition in the sky. But many objects can be placed just about anywhere. It can be difficult to decide where to place things, so I would recommend using guides like the rule of thirds to help you out. Typically, your main subject does not look very good dead center on the canvas, so you may want to move it to one of these other regions of the grid. You can place subjects inside the boxes, along the lines, or at the intersection of lines. In my oak tree painting, I ended the top of the tree on this horizontal guide in the top right. As you can see, everything is very balanced and spread out into the different regions of the grid. Again, this is not something you have to use, it's just here if you want it. Just as well, if you're sketching a reference onto your canvas, a grid like this can really help you translate everything from the photo into the right spot on the canvas. Simply make the reference the same aspect ratio as the canvas, and then use the same grid on both the reference and the canvas. Plein air painters sometimes utilize this as well with a frame divided by strings that they can see through. To learn more about the rule of thirds, see my reference video. These reference videos are linked to in the transcript of this course. It's also important to note that since you are working digitally, you can compose as you paint. For example, in this painting of the oak tree, I can actually move and reshape the tree so long as it is on a separate layer. Still, it would be best to plot out most of your arrangement before you start painting so that you will have a rough guide to follow that you are happy with. While arrangement deals with where objects will sit in the scene, there are more detail-oriented elements to composition which we will explore next.